Hello, this is Music Tech Help Guy. Welcome to episode 70 of my Logic Pro 10 video tutorial series. In this episode, we're continuing on our mix mini-series of our song Living on the Run. As I've said before, if you want to purchase this session to practice your mixing skills, I'll put a link down in the video description below. In this episode, we're going to talk about using sends and aux tracks for time-based effects. What I mean by time-based effects are things like reverb, delay, often chorus, flanger, phaser, things like that. Oftentimes I get mixes from my students and from people who just want sort of a second opinion, and I look at their mix and they've got like 20 reverb plugins up there, and I'm like, what are you doing, dude? You don't necessarily need to duplicate reverb plugins directly on a channel strip. The general rule about using reverb is to put the reverb on an aux track and then use a send to bus the signal over to the aux track. And there's several advantages to doing it that way. The first is you're not wasting a bunch of processing power. Like for instance, in this video, I'm going to put reverb on my all my vocal tracks. Now, rather than putting 8 different reverb plugins on my 8 vocal tracks, I'm going to just create one auxiliary channel strip that is basically a vocal reverb track, and I'm going to use the sends here, right here, so sends. I'm going to use the sends to send the signal or bus the signal over to that aux track. So we're not wasting the processing power of having 8 reverb plugins on 8 tracks. The same goes with delay, chorus, flanger, phaser. I will say that the exception to the rule is that if you're using like an instrument, like a software synth, and you decide to add reverb directly to it or delay directly to it, I sort of consider that part of the sound synthesis of the instrument. So in those cases, I'd say it's okay. But when you're adding reverb or delay to vocals or drums or something like that, then you're going to want to do it this way. So it depends on how many tracks need the reverb. And it depends on whether you're mixing a live instrument or you're mixing a software instrument. So here's how this works. I'm going to select all of my vocal tracks. I'm going to go up to the sends here. And there's only one send, but just like with the inserts, as you start creating them, it'll create more and more of them. I'm going to click on my send slot, and I'm going to go down to bus, and I'm going to choose one of my blank buses. I've already used buses 1 through 7, so I'm going to go with bus 8. And what this will create is a send on bus 8. And one of the things I love about Logic, as I said before when we were talking about using subgroups or submixes or submasters, is it automatically creates an aux track for us over here with the corresponding input, bus 8. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this aux track Vox Verb, because this is where our vocal reverb is going to go. So what I'm going to do is on this channel or on this aux track, on the inserts, I'm going to choose the plugin under reverb called Space Designer. Space Designer is an awesome convolution reverb plugin that I've said this before, and I'll say it again, is totally worth, this plugin alone is totally worth the $200 purchase price of Logic. It's an awesome reverb plugin. I really love it. The only other reverb plugin I like more than Space Designer is like the Oxford reverbs, which are way more expensive than Logic. They're like $600 or $800. But this is a great place to start. There's some great modeled reverbs in here. What I mean by convolution reverb is that Space Designer actually has the ability to learn or map the impulse response of a real life room and then apply it to the plugin. Maybe I'll go over how to do that in a much later video, maybe in the Dendum series of this main series, but it's something that Space Designer can do that's really cool. For now, we're just going to stick to the presets. And in a future video, by the way, I will go over what everything in Space Designer does. It won't be in this video. So the preset I'm going to use for vocals is under medium spaces, plate reverbs. I'm going to use the one that's called soft plate. Here we go. Now, when you use reverb on an aux track, you want to make sure you keep the dry signal all the way down, and the reverb signal, it doesn't have to be all the way up, but up. Now, the reason for this, and this is sort of the number 2 reason why it's good to put reverb on an aux track, is it separates the dry signal from the wet signal. So when we're all done here, we're going to have an aux track that individually controls the reverb amount of all of these vocals, and then a dry signal that's on all the vocals. So we're separating the wet and the dry and the wet signal. Whereas if I put the Space Designer directly on the channel strip, I'd have to play around with the dry and wet or dry and reverb sliders on each individual track, which is going to take more time. So let's go back to our vocal tracks here, and let's talk about what a send actually is. A send is a way to sort of split the audio signal off of a channel strip over to another area. And so what this does is, unlike when we talked about creating submixes, unlike just creating a bus on the output of all these tracks and just routing the output of the tracks over to a common aux track, what we're doing now is we're actually splitting the signal and sending some of the signal on bus 8 over to our Vox Verb track. So we're still going to hear sort of the dry output of these tracks, but we're also going to hear the signal that's sent over to the Space Designer here that's going to be our wet signal. So what we have to do is we actually have to pull up the send amount, and that's what this little knob here does. One of the things I love about Logic's sends is that it doesn't require a little extra tearaway strip. If you guys are Pro Tools users, you'll know that in Pro Tools there's a separate little fader that pops up for each send, which I find it annoying. Some people like it. I don't really like it. So generally what I'll do is I want the reverb signal on the tracks to be significantly lower than the dry signal. So there's no reason to, put these on 0. I'll put it down, say, on -10. That'll work. The other thing to keep in mind is that I want to hear more reverb on my lead vocal track, so the verse track and then the lead chorus track, more so than the backing vocals. So what I can do here is just drag over the backing vocals and pull down the sends so that I hear less reverb on those. This is just a matter of preference. I mean, some people would say put more reverb on the backing vocals to make them sound more distant. I really don't want the backing vocals to pop out in the mix any more than they have to, and that includes their reverb. So I'm going to put those, pull the send amount down a bit. So if I just solo out just the vocal tracks, and I'll also just create a loop on the pre-verse and chorus here. Let's see what this sounds like. It's going to play the dry signal and the reverb signal, and I'll explain in just a moment.
Pray for death to take me quickly, living life in a lie.
You hear that reverb tail? Unlike Pro Tools, Logic will actually automatically include the send in the solo. So if I solo these, it's also sort of soloing whatever the sends are going to. So if I actually mute my Vox Verb track over here, we won't hear the reverb anymore.
Pray for death to take me quickly, living life in a lie.
And if I unmute my Vox Verb track over here,
pray for death to take me quickly, living life in a lie. You've already taken much from me.
so you can see that the Vox Verb track is getting some signal, and that's because all of these audio tracks are sending a certain amount of the signal. They're splitting part of the amount of the signal and sending it over to the aux track here with the reverb on it. So the wonderful thing about this is that if I just want to sort of listen to what the wet signal is, I can just solo the Vox Verb track. So you can hear there, we're hearing most of the lead vocal and not so much of the backing vocals. And you can also sort of pull this up and down and individually control the wet signal from the dry signal. So if I want to sort of just mix this and figure out where I want my reverb to set in the mix, I can just I'll just unsolo everything, listen to the whole song, and find a reverb amount that sort of fits what I'm looking for.
Pray for death to take me quickly, living life in a lie.
You can do the same thing with delay, with chorus effects. I may choose to do some delay later on, but for now, I'm just going to stick with this one reverb. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create some reverb for my drum mix. Now, yes, some people have pointed out, yes, I still have tracks clipping. It's okay. I'll worry about the clipping later. I'm just going to sort of get all of the plugins that I want in here, and then I'll worry about leveling things out later. So don't worry, I'll get to that. With the drums, I like to rely pretty heavily on the room mics and the overhead mics. But I do want to wet these drums up just a bit, especially our snare drums, since our snare is now a replaced sample-based snare, as we went over in the previous video. So I'm going to create a send for these. Go bus 9. I'm going to pull all these up just a hair. There we go. Let's solo those out. Go over to our newly created Aux-9 over here, which has an input of bus 9. I'm going to name this drum verb. I'm going to put another Space Designer plugin on here. And I'm just going to, again, use a preset for now. Go to medium spaces, rooms. Let's go to the let's go to the stone wall room. There we go. Again, dry signal all the way down. And by the way, if you pull the dry signal up, you're just going to hear sort of a copy of the signal that you're sending over to the aux track. If you keep it all the way down, we're just hearing the wet signal here. So when you're using reverb directly on a channel strip, like with a synthesizer, you may want to actually, pull the dry signal up a bit. But since we're using it on an aux track, we're going to keep the dry signal all the way down. So let me solo the drum verb there. Let's see what this sounds like now. So that's just the wet signal on there. Yeah, I decided I didn't really like that one. It was a bit too long for my taste, so I went with Plate Reverb's drum plate. Now, the other great thing about using sends for reverb as opposed to, again, putting everything on individual channel strips is that I can sort of keep the same reverb setting over there on the aux track, but then what I can do is I can individually set how much reverb I want on each instrument. So generally what I do is I don't want a whole lot of reverb on the kick drum, really none on the sub kick, or on the sub kick. I like a lot on the snare drum, a lot on the cymbals and overheads to sort of accentuate the room a bit. The room mics, it doesn't really matter. We're getting mostly ambient sound from that anyway. And then a bit on the toms as well. So I pretty much keep the kick really low and then the snare pretty high, and then everything else is sort of just, up to whatever sounds good. So let's just see what this sounds like now. There's our wet signal. And there's everything together. So your question might be, when do I use reverb and when's it appropriate to use reverb? In a tune like this, like a rock and roll tune, I will typically use reverb on vocals. I'll have one aux track for vocal reverb, and I'll have one aux track for drum reverb. For guitar, I typically don't use reverb except with Space Designer's cabinet emulators, which I'll go over in the next video. It has some cabinet, some reverbs that sort of emulate speaker sounds, which are kind of cool. So maybe I'll go over those in the next video. But here it's not. Why I'm not going to use it here. Synthesizers, you could throw Space Designer on there for a little bit more ambience, but Again, with synths, it's totally okay to throw, reverb directly on the channel strip. It's just when you have multiple tracks of vocals or multiple tracks of drums, then you have to start worrying about, using too many Space Designer plugins, which is going to cause Logic to crash because you're overloading the CPU. Lead guitar, if you need reverb, you could throw it on there. With lead guitar, you could almost just throw it right on the aux track, but I tend to not use reverb on guitar leads. I tend to go with delays over leads, but I'll cover that when we get to the delay designer plugin. Now, one last thing I want to go over is the difference between. Here we go. Just click on one of our sends here. Click on one of our sends. There we go. The difference between post-pan, post-fader, and pre-fader sends. Believe it or not, even though the way the channel strip looks, it looks like we're signal flow top to bottom. What it looks like is we're going inserts, sends, output, pan, fader. What's really actually happening signal flow wise is inserts, fader, pan, then output. And you can sort of choose where the send goes in that order. If you use the stock post pan, it means that any changes you make here on the fader or on the pan knob will affect the way the reverb over here sounds. So if I pan this hard right, the reverb is going to show up hard right. Let me just solo that out for you so you can hear what that sounds like.
Pray for death to take me quickly living.
And likewise, because it's post pan, it's also post fader. So if I pull the fader up or down,
Pray for death to take me quickly living life in a lie.
you'll see that the amount of reverb is also affected. If you choose post fader, because the pan knob actually comes after the fader, post fader means that the fader will still affect the signal, just like it did, just as I showed you there, but the pan won't affect the signal.
Pray for death to take me quickly living life in a lie.
So what that means is that even though the dry signal is being panned left or right, the reverb itself is not being panned left or right. And then lastly, we have pre-fader, where any pan or volume changes we make will not affect the amount of reverb at all. So the send is coming before reverb and coming before pan.
Pray for death to take me quickly living life in a lie. You've already taken much over me.
So in this case, I could pull this volume all the way up or all the way down, pull the pan all the way left or all the way right, and we're still going to get the same amount and the same pan balance of our reverb over here. Some people actually prefer pre-fader for reverb. I don't. I actually like post-pan for pretty much everything except for like creating Q mixes. The only thing I really use pre-fader for is if I'm creating a Q mix that's going out to a headphone box, so that whatever musician you're working with can sort of create their own mix that's independent of your mix. So that's the only thing I really ever use pre-fader for. Sometimes I find that post-fader is nice because it keeps the left and right balance of the reverb the same regardless of where the actual dry signal is. But it's really up to perception. Whatever you think sounds the best, trust your ears and go with it. Like I said, I tend to use post-pan or post-fader for reverb and delay effects, but I tend to not use pre-fader, and I really only use pre-fader for creating Q mixes for a headphone box. So I'm going to go ahead and stick those on. I'll go ahead and stick these on post-fader, and I'll do the same for my drums. There we go. All right, so let me play just a little few seconds of this for you. I haven't been playing as much of the full song lately because YouTube keeps flagging me for copyright, even though it's my song. I own the rights to it. So let me just play a bit of this for you. Yeah, a little too much reverb. My rule about reverb is if someone says, hey, that reverb is really cool sounding, probably means you have too much reverb going on. I like reverb to sort of support and balance the vocals a bit, but not be overtly noticeable. That's just my general rule about it. Same thing goes with the drums. So I tend to go with really a much lower reverb levels than most people do, unless you're looking for like a real ambient sound.
Never change our ways. Oh Lord, why can't you lift me high when we're just living on the run?
And there we go. So that's sends and how to use time-based effects with sends and aux tracks. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks again for watching.